Well, let me restate the issue. In recent years, a number of powerful people have been finding themselves under the scrutiny of international law, on trial as war criminals or for crimes against their own people. First we had Pinochet, more recently Milosevic, and last night we looked at the case against Ariel Sharon. Now, the Pinochet case inadvertently revealed something of the workings of a man whose name has long been tainted, at least with a whiff of political immorality, Henry Kissinger. I interviewed Kissinger a few years back on this very program when he was pushing his book Diplomacy, his account of his skillful handling of Cold War realpolitik in the 60s and 70s being in the centre of that very thick volume. Kissinger, of course, has always been a tricky character, and it may be that his real skill is in hiding the extent of his involvement with any number of disreputable operations against sovereign countries, including murders, kidnappings and the illegal supply of arms to countries like Indonesia. I was interested to learn recently that Nixon had only met Kissinger once, briefly, before he appointed him as a national security advisor. One factor that most convinced me of Kissinger's credibility, wrote Nixon, was the length to which he went to protect his own secrecy. Now, there's long been a question mark over the level of HK's involvement with the coup against Allende in Chile in 1970, and the extent to which he presided over the death of innocent civilians in Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. But is he a war criminal? Christopher Hitchens thinks so. And we've got the author of The Trial of Henry Kissinger on the phone. And Christopher, thanks for clumbering out of your bed at the ridiculously early hour of 5 a.m. It's been a long-held view of the left since the days of the counterculture that Kissinger should be tried for war crimes for his complicity in the bombing of Cambodia, through to his interventions in Chile. But no one's been brave enough to take him on. Why are you doing so now?
Well, your excellent introduction more or less answers that question. I decided after the arrest of Pinochet in London, and with the issuing of what was then the warrant for the arrest of Milosevic in former Yugoslavia, that the international climate had changed. The British House of Lords decided, the British Special Branch having made the arrest, that the defence of sovereign immunity, in other words, yes, I did do this, but I claim that I did it under colour of law because I was a politician, wouldn't hold, didn't wash anymore. And so if you add that to universal jurisdiction, in other words, the ability of a Spanish magistrate to get Pinochet picked up on a warrant by the British cops in London, the oxygen around Henry Kissinger had suddenly begun to thin considerably, and I came into possession of a videotape, which I transcribed early on in the book, of Kissinger in extreme alarm, talking to his publisher about the jurisdictional implications for himself. And I thought, well, if Kissinger is worried about this, maybe he's quicker on the draw, quicker on the uptake than the human rights movement has been. Now might be the time to rehearse what those difficulties might be. Of course, the other thing is that very recently a great deal of new evidence has come to light, especially about Chile, which puts him directly in the frame. And as you may know, on the 28th of May last, he was in the Ritz, Kissinger was in the Ritz Hotel in Paris on some UNESCO junket, and the gendarmerie came round and served him a summons from a French judge, Judge Roger Leloir, requiring that he come to the Palais de Justice the following day and answer questions about 5 missing Frenchmen from the Pinochet years in Chile, and about his knowledge of Pinochet's death squad activities. And he fled town. He took a powder. He ran off to Italy the next day, wouldn't answer any of the questions.
You must also be motivated, Chris, by the hypocrisy of American justice, which tries foreign leaders for war crimes, whilst allowing its own to shelter under that sovereign immunity.
Well, there you go, because you see the next thing that happens is he gets a summons from the Judge Guzman, in the Pinochet case, more or less on the same topic, Operation Condor, as it was known, the secret coordination between the secret police forces of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Paraguay, and Ecuador, in the years of dictatorship. And it's the way it would track down dissidents, not just in Central and South America, but would kill them as far away as in Washington, D.C. and in Rome. And finally, a judge in Argentina, a senior magistrate called Rodolfo Corral, has also issued him a summons. So it's actually fair to say that the old rhetorical term, well, Henry Kissinger is a war criminal, is a bit more like a legal job description now. He's wanted for questioning by magistrates in 3 democracies on 2 continents.
Christopher, let's open the trial.
About very grave crimes against humanity, and he's on the run.
Mm.
So
well, this book will accelerate his pace. Let's begin the trial with, as you do, with the open secret that's too momentous and too awful to tell.
Well, the way that Henry Kissinger's career of crime was launched was also touched on by something you said when you were introducing me, which was the way he caught Richard Nixon's eye. In 1968, this used to be a hypothesis also, but it's now been proven, and I document it, I think, more fully than anyone else has yet done in the opening of my book. Richard Nixon, whose last chance to become president this was, decided that even though the majority of the American establishment had given up on the Vietnam War, had concluded that at the very least it was a terrible mistake, that there was still some domestic political mileage in it, and he and Spiro Agnew and John Mitchell, his campaign manager, evolved a plan to go to the South Vietnamese military government and say to them, if you pull out of Lyndon Johnson's peace talks in Paris, and if you do so, and time it in such a way as to influence the election, in other words, to destroy the Democratic Party's peace plank, you'll get a better deal from us when or if we're elected. Now, we know that. I know it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but Johnson had them bugged. He got wind of this treasonous activity, had them bugged, and we've got the transcripts now of it. So it's not a hypothesis, it's a fact. The fourth man in that transaction was Henry Kissinger, who was attached as a liberal Rockefeller Republican to the peace talks in Paris, and he became a secret informer of Nixon's about what the advanced negotiating positions of the U.S. government were. So Nixon had perfect knowledge in his attempt to sabotage the peace talks and destabilize the Democratic Party's re-election campaign. And that sort of illegal mortgage, as I call it, on 4 more years of war, when Nixon did win, because the South Vietnamese did pull out 2 days before the election, and Nixon won by whisker, that illegal mortgage had to be paid off, and the first installment in paying it off was that Nixon, who didn't like intellectuals, didn't like Jews, didn't like East Coast academics, and had only met Kissinger once, and not privately even, met him for a second time and asked him to be national security advisor, because he knew talent when he saw it. And so, and already what became exposed later on as an actually criminal regime, a rogue regime in the U.S., conceived with this awful piece of wickedness and subversion, came to power committed to extending a war against civilians, and of course extended that war into Cambodia secretly. The first article of impeachment drawn up by the House of Representatives against Nixon was illegally bombing Cambodia, by the way. It was never pressed, unfortunately, because there was a plea bargain, but that's how serious it was, and really a star was born and a one-man international rolling crime wave begins.
You make the point, or you remind us in the book, that 4 years down the track Nixon would conclude the war on the same terms as had been on offer in Paris, and in those 4 years 20,000 Americans and an incalculable number of Vietnamese, Cambodians and Laotians lost their lives.
Yes, nearly half the names that appear on the Vietnam Memorial Wall are incised for dates after Nixon's inauguration. Senator Kerry, for example, whose difficulties you may have read about recently, now President Kerry of the New School in New York, butchered those kids and their grandparents in the Mekong Delta about 3 weeks after Nixon was inaugurated. All that in a thing called Operation Speedy Express, which I write about in my book, in fact. All of that was really criminally, tragically unnecessary. And yes, as you say, in the end, Nixon and Kissinger had to conclude the war very ignominiously on roughly the outlined terms of the Paris Agreement. Yeah.
Now, your efforts and the prosecution are somewhat undermined by the fact that much of the evidence required to indict Kissinger currently resides in the Library of Congress under a deed that keeps them inaccessible until 5 years after his death. Now, this might suggest the bloke is trying to hide something, but it also makes it impossible, does it not, to try him while he's still alive and kicking?
Not necessarily. For example, there is persisting now a trial and investigation in Washington into the murder of Orlando Letelier, who had been Allende's foreign minister and became a very senior Chilean exile dissident politician in the Pinochet years. And Pinochet had him blown up in a car bomb, which also killed an American citizen, a friend of Orlando's who was driving him. Not far from where I live, in the Sheridan Circle in downtown D.C. in October 1976, I assure you, cynical though you may be, it's still very illegal to let off car bombs in rush hour traffic in the diplomatic area of D.C. and kill American citizens. And this trial is still an active case, and there is, in my opinion, an indictment of Pinochet pending. Now, some of Kissinger's documents in the Library of Congress have been subpoenaed in the course of this investigation. They're not immune to that kind of disclosure or discovery. I just think, and I press in my book for the wider application of that as a general matter of open government and of rediscovering what the archives of that period would really tell us. What Kissinger did when he left office in the sort of collapsing scenery of the Nixon-Ford years was put all his papers from the State Department onto a truck. No one else at the State has ever tried such a thing before, and had them whisked to the Rockefeller family estate at Pocantico Hills, which in New York, which he then had, in a very shady way, designated as a secure site, which it wasn't. And there was a lot of litigation about this. And by one vote, just one vote on the Supreme Court, he was allowed not to keep them, but nor was he forced to give them back, and they had this compromise with the Library of Congress. But it's not completely written in stone.
Tell us about the 40 Committee.
The 40 Committee is the name given to the body that oversees all United States covert operations. It's the final decision taker about covert ops, and the important thing about Henry Kissinger, who began his career as a national security advisor and retained that role when he became Secretary of State, he's the only person ever to have held both positions simultaneously, is that at all times when he was in office, he was also chairman of the 40 Committee. In other words, if you hear of something, or if something comes to light, such as, which is, I devote a chapter to it, the murder of the head of the Chilean General Staff, General René Schneider, between the election of Allende and Allende's inauguration. Something of that sort, something of that order. You have to know that the 40 Committee would have had to sit on this. I mean, sit on it in the sense of consider it, monitor it, decide it, and so forth. So Henry Kissinger's fingerprints are, by definition, by part of his job description, on any such operation. So he doesn't have the deniability that some secretaries of state would have had to say, well, I didn't know the CIA was doing this while I was pursuing this policy, because the wires ran through the same hand. And that's therefore very important in demolishing a defense he occasionally uses when caught, which is to pretend that he didn't know. And in this case, it would simply be to pretend he wasn't doing his job.
This is Alan Earl on Radio National, Radio Australia and the World Wide Web, and I'm speaking by dawn's early light to Christopher Hitchens, author of The Trial of Henry Kissinger. Tell us about Kissinger's involvement with the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975. Now, we know how many lives were lost, and we know that it began an unprecedented era of oppression against the East Timorese people. What was Kissinger's involvement in this?
Henry Kissinger, along with his then President Gerald Ford, was in the room with the Indonesian General Staff on the day the decision for the invasion was taken. And we now know, and I can prove in my book, because I have the transcript of a very tense meeting at the State Department following, that Kissinger knew of and approved in advance the annexation of East Timor by Indonesia, and furthermore promised them that they would not run out of American weaponry with which to conduct this hideous operation, and that's where the shoe pinched at the State Department, because there was and there still remains a law, the Military Assistance Act, that says Indonesia and other countries may not use American weaponry except for self-defense, and no one ever advanced the theory that Indonesia was being invaded by East Timor. And as a result, Congress had to consider cutting off weapons, and so and Kissinger was very, very angry about this, and had a row with his civil servants, and admitted that the law had been broken. Indonesia had broken international law in one way, and American law had been broken in another. In the course of that argument, he absolutely destroys the excuse that he's since made in public, which was that this genocidal assault came to him as a surprise. I mean, he confesses in this document that I've reproduced that he knew in advance and thought it was a dandy idea. So he's complicit in those two breaches of law, and also, I would say, I argue, in a very gross violation of the Genocide Convention, to which the U.S. is a signatory. The Genocide Convention says that, if once you get the news that an attempt to destroy a people in whole or in part is underway, you are obliged to act, not just to punish, but to prevent it.
Let me ask you this, Christopher. Are you dodging the subpoena service? Is Kissinger threatening you with legal action?
No, I'm threatening him with legal action, as a matter of fact. On another matter, he issued a gross defamation of me when he was asked to comment on my allegations. He's been trying to avoid commenting on them for a long time. He's been trying to avoid me personally. He's twice left town. We're both on a book tour at the moment, as a matter of coincidence. Separate book tours, but we've intersected twice, and when we do, he's cancelled. But anyway, when he was asked what he thought of my allegations, he resorted to hysterical defamation and said that I was a denier of the Nazi Holocaust. I don't know where that came from, but I know where I'm going with it, which is to court. And in the under American law, if you accuse someone of having grossly libeled and lied about you, you're also entitled to show that they lie on other things as well. In other words, I can try and compel him to discuss other matters that he doesn't want to talk about, and try and discover his documents. It may not come to that. He may make a retraction, which would be the cleverest thing for him to do.
Surely the great duopoly of American democracy will close ranks on this issue, because it would frighten the hell out of almost any presidency, any regime, if you were to win on the issue of Kissinger.
Well, of course, you're right to an extent. The Bush administration is supporting Kissinger and saying he doesn't have to answer these questions, and that these judges ought to write to the State Department if they want information about Chile in the 70s. But actually, those judges have already tried that and not got any answer out of them. So the U.S. is in the odd position of defending a citizen who's wanted for questioning on 2 continents and in 3 democracies. Now, as you, I think, hinted earlier, since the United States doesn't take this tone of voice when talking to, say, Serbia, or to the Rwandans, or to the Cubans, or, in general, anyone, it says, we want speedy delivery of those who are wanted on war crimes charges, and we want you to face your own society and its past and make a full inquiry. The extent to which it's willing to exempt itself from these injunctions is now sort of terrifyingly large. In fact, I think it's too large to be justified. I don't think they can actually afford to say that we describe a crime against humanity as something not committed by an American. It's too egregious, and there are not a few people in the United States, lawyers among them, and human rights professionals who are sensitive to this double standard and who can make something of it.
Now, dear listeners, the full indictment can be found within the pages of Christopher's new book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. Christopher, thanks for that. You can now go